Okay, so could the speakers for the next session come and take their seat? Of course, the relevance of that joke to this session is that it's about perspective taking, that people can look at the same thing in different ways. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at different perspectives. The plan for this session then is that we're going to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves, to then spend about a minute describing their organization, and to identify two questions which may or may not be research questions that their organization would like to answer. Now, to be fair to them, we've got them on the hop a bit because we'd asked them to do more than that. But if we give them a chance to do more than that, then you won't have time to interact with them and to discuss with them. But first, I want to try and contextualize this in terms of this idea of partnership. And I've already said at the beginning that what I don't want, in a sense, at the end of this session is for everyone to come away from it like it's a big group hug and we think we should all work together more. So, within the context of partnership, there's, I suppose, two things that I would see very key. One is to do with evidence and the idea of evidence-based practice. And the other one is to do with governance, research governance. And I'm sure if I asked you, do you think that good research governance is a good idea? You'd all say, yes, it's a good idea. I think one of the problems with research governance is that sometimes it can reflect dominance. I'm going to give you some examples. And in terms of evidence-based practice, I think sometimes evidence can be extremely dangerous. And I want to give you some examples. So the examples I'm going to give you are really from my own personal experience. And they're to try and, I suppose, loosen up the topic so that we can talk a bit more candidly. So you can interpret each of these themes I'm going to talk about as me, in one case, having a go at the NGOs, and in the other case, having a go at the academics. Okay, so in terms of evidence being a dangerous commodity, my first encounter with this was over 20 years ago when I did some research with an NGO, a nameless NGO in Africa that was working in a refugee camp, and it was looking at trying to establish the effectiveness of their program for providing education about HIV. So I was working with them. We did the research, and we found what I thought was terribly significant findings. We found that the program that they developed had a very significant increase in the knowledge of men in the refugee camp, and it had no effect on the increase of knowledge of women in the refugee camp. As a sort of naive researcher, I thought, gosh, this is a really interesting result. Let's go and publish it. Cut a long story short, I was told that if I did publish it, I would be sued. I don't need to go into the length of what transpired then, but I had a very naive idea. Here's a nice finding. It's sort of inert in some way, but it's academically interesting. But of course, the NGO had other concerns about it. And I must say, legitimate concerns. Fast forward 10 years, when I was fortunate to be part of a so-called expert group that the OECD got together to look at the future of international aid, as they called it. And we were particularly looking at the implementation of the Paris Declaration. And in that, we had a very interesting discussion around how to measure outcomes. And myself and various other people suggested that perhaps one way of implementing the Paris Declaration was to try and collect evidence that NGOs were aligning their work with low-income country governments, that they were harmonizing with each other, and most fundamentally, that they were being effective, that there was evidence for the effectiveness of their outcomes. Again, naively, I thought that this was fairly straightforward comment, during one of the breaks in the session, I was subsequently attacked by various people that this was, again, sort of academic naivety, and that the world was much too complex, and that to ask for evidence in that way was problematic. Okay, now I said these were all going to be personal, and so fast forward another 10 years to a few weeks ago when we had our Evidence Aid conference, which my colleague Bonix here coordinates from the Centre for Global Health. So this is Evidence Aid is an initiative looking at providing evidence for emergency relief situations. We had the launch of this in Oxford, and we had lots of interest from UN organizations and from NGOs. We didn't have any Irish NGOs. I was asked, how come if this project is being run out of the Centre for Global Health and being directed by Mike Clark at Queen's University, how come there were no Irish NGOs at that? So again, I don't think that the absence of Irish NGOs is just accidental. I think it's because evidence is very problematic. So I think evidence can be dangerous. From the dominant side, again going back 20 years from a personal experience point of view, I was the head of a department of an African University of Malawi, and we were approached by an Ivy League university and asked to provide research assistance for one of their projects. We were very enthusiastic about this until they told us that they weren't actually going to pay any of the research assistance. We said, okay, well, if they're not going to gain that way, then presumably they're going to be co-authors on your papers. And we were told, no, there wasn't going to be any of that, but that our students would gain greatly through the experience of working with this excellent university. And this approach had been approved from that university's research ethics committee. So this was seen to be an ethical way of interacting with us. 10 years later, I guess, in Ireland, coming here, I felt, gosh, Ireland has really got to be a terrific place to come and do work around international development. We are the most generous country in the world. If you look at donations for things like the Asian tsunami, we're twice as generous as the next most generous country. We have the highest density of NGOs, probably in the world relative to our population. We have a tradition of missionary work and so on. And so academia within this area should be really, really strong. Now, certainly, 10 years ago, there were some high points within the Irish research landscape. But generally, I would have to say, in my opinion, that in fact there was very weak engagement between academia, between academic researchers and the NGO community more generally. And it was tended to be what some people call extractive research, where we go in, take stuff out, and head off again. Often, in the case of we go in, tell someone they've got a problem, and then go away and publish our results, but don't actually do anything about the problem. Fast forward, finally, 10 years, and since I've sort of had a go at academics and at NGOs, want to have a go at Irish Aid here as well. And this is with regard to the idea of what is it that, for instance, the HEA and Irish Aid are trying to achieve in this collaborative project that they've been funding. There's been some terrific research that's come out of this, but it rather led me to think in terms of this research governance, surely the aims of someone like Irish Aid should be to develop research excellence in low-income countries, and maybe they're different from the aims of the HEA, which I suppose is to develop research excellence in Ireland. Now, of course, they're not incompatible aims, but when we consider things like where should the research be led from, then I think it should clearly be led from the low-income countries. A couple of days ago, I was at a conference in London, and I was being told by someone with great pride that their centre was the world-leading centre for a particular type of tropical illness. And I remarked to them, isn't that interesting, because London isn't in the tropics? A point that was completely lost on them. Okay, so these are points of reference, I guess, in terms of the danger of evidence and perhaps the dominance agendas in governance. And perhaps these are things that we can pick up on in a more general discussion. So we're really just going to go through people in the order that they are here. Briefly, please introduce yourselves, say a bit about your organization, identify a couple of questions that are important to your organization, which Sarah will kindly write up. And then we're going to come back to you with hopefully a lot of questions where you'll have a chance to embellish on your views, and also, if you like, to answer, if you wish, some of the issues that I've raised. Okay, Paul, to start.
I remember So thanks very much. So my name is Paul Walsh, and I have a chair in International Development Studies in UCD. So I guess I'm just going to just talk a little bit about two programs that I run in particular, and just make one or two comments about the issues that maybe Mac has brought up in a general sense. And then I want to just talk about one big idea, right?
Can I just suggest that comments about sort of what I've said could be held till the end, if that's okay.
Don't worry, I was only being nice to you. Okay. Anyway, the first issue that I want to, it's a really important issue, is that, and even when an academic is asked this question, I think you have to be able to answer it. And it comes as simple as this: what does a university do? What are you there for? Right? And I think it takes a while to think about this, but if you go back in history, what you'll realize that the origins of a university are generally around professional training, right? Because if you think of a society, you need medics, you need nurses, you need teachers, you need accountants, you need economists, I don't know, and so on, okay? So in a large extent, universities, a country could not perform economically or any other way without a strong university or strong universities, and that is just a basic belief, right? Now, within that, it was also true that universities were very careful to stay away from religious influences, state influences, and private interest, right? Because what can happen, and I think Mark kind of can say that, is money can come along from state or private sector. They can push research agendas. They can push you in directions that you're maybe not that interested in. And one big consequence for Ireland, I think, is that when we first approached this HEA Irish Aid project and we were looking across Trinity and UCD, we realized that there was very little work done on global issues, right? Even though if you went into a classroom, you talked to individuals that were supposed to rank what are the key issues in this world, are they in the curriculum? Are they in our research programs? Are they in our mastery? And that's a problem, okay? Now, just to tell you one issue here, the whole aim of this global Masters in Development Practice that you heard Claire is one of our students, is actually to bring a thing called professional training and development practice, right? Because there's professional training to be an engineer, there's professional training to be a doctor, but where is professional training in development practice. And it's a degree that's delivered by 22 universities across the world that marries science and social science, and also marries NGOs with universities both in Africa, in our case, National University of Rwanda, and in Dublin. Right? Now, the thing is there's a realization in the foundation document, right, that the only way that you will get good development practice is to actually dream it together, because it actually doesn't exist. What's happening inside universities at the moment, what's happening outside the NGOs, and you're saying you want an intersection, that's a completely new area, right? That's what innovation is about, right? So unless you're in the classroom together, ex ante, dreaming about things, thinking about things, what can we do together? That's when you get the creation, that's when you get the execution, etc., right? So just to tell you, that's what that's there for. Okay. Second issue. The other program I run is a doctoral program, not unlike Indigo in structure. Again, and this is where I ran into problem with Irish Aid, etc. Again, when we went out to East Africa, again, my background is academia. I understand the role of a university. I understand the importance of the mainstream activity of a university. So when you go inside and you talk to their people, and they say, we want proper training of our staff, we want staff to be trained up to a PhD level, both people in education colleges, engineers, medics, economists, lawyers, etc., etc. I listen to that, and the bottom line is, the program that we've set up, we have half our students funded, 11 funded by Irish Aid, another 11 by other agencies. This is just all about the staff there themselves, with their supervisors, coming to us, dreaming up their own vision of the future. We don't interfere in what they want to research on, like any doctoral student, and we just facilitate that, which is delivering a PhD, like developing an undergraduate course, a master's course. It's a mainstream activity. Okay? And I think there's an awful lot of merit in that, right? Because, again, you have to be very careful about the influence of state and agencies, religious orders, private entities, you know, whatever. They will give you money and influence what you should be doing and and I think we should reject that. And that's what academia is here for, and that's what we should do. And that should be respected. Having said that, right, in a way all I'm saying is shift things to ex ante, dream together, don't impose a way of thinking on people and then force them to do it ex post, okay? The last point, the big idea, okay? Having said, what do I think could happen? Or where would be the big intersection if I was to do something with concern, let's say, right? I am very aware that science is not being done for the bottom 6 billion people in this world. Science is very focused on the top billion people, okay? And part of the problem is that when the big companies like Pfizer, you know, instead of investing in drugs for the poor, come up with Viagra or whatever they want to do, recreational drugs. The problem is that income is so skewed in the world that it's always best to fight over the top billion's income. Maybe not with this financial crisis, maybe we'll clear it 50% or something, but that's just the way it is, right? But then you ask them, well, why don't they roll out science? Or why are people not looking at science? It is not that easy to do clinical and translational work in the developing world, right? Because of governance issues, conflict, you know, lots of different issues, right? But the thing is that NGOs have kind of solved that. They have kind of learned through their networks and their bases to actually, you know, carry out interventions and evaluation of interventions, right? So there is no harm that if you have research, and again, these are academics now who are just pure researchers, they have no agenda from a private or any sort of interest. If they want to go and test the theories in their labs, the nanoscience stuff, it's all great. Or if they want to, even social science who want to test behavioral parameters or social network sort of structures that they're looking at and all these theories. There is no harm that with an NGO they go out, they actually implement things, they evaluate them, and they can do them in a way, I think, that should be there. The aim is to roll it out at a national or global level. What you should be trying to do is to find something that can actually latch on to something quite globally that can make a big difference. Right? So for me, in the Innovation Academy here, I actually think, together with NGOs and some private sector people who are protecting green technologies, all this sort of stuff, solar stuff, I actually think you can do what I call these very standard feasibility pilot studies. You can explore what works and what doesn't work, and then you can take it to market and it can work. And it's innovation for society, it's innovation for people, and it can be a win-win, and that it can be extremely profitable, and it also can actually hit a lot of the objectives and targets that we have both in an NGO and in a university. Anyway, they're my points of view.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Paul, like myself, is trained to speak for 50 minutes at a time, so that was it was appreciated that you kept that down. I'm going to stay standing because I think that gives me more authority to reduce people's speaking time. So, Brona, would you like to go next, please?
Thank you. Is the microphone on there? Yes. My name is Brona Carr, and I work for Irish Aid in our policy unit, and one of my jobs is in relation to providing oversight to our research work and the development of a research strategy. I think, first of all, to say Irish Aid is delighted to be participating here today. We are raising all the right questions. The challenge, of course, is in getting answers to some of those and moving the issues forward. In terms of our own approach to research and the framework of our research strategy, it is about a particular type of research. It's development research that is about problem solving for poor people with the overall goal of poverty and vulnerability being reduced through the application of improved evidence. Back to that evidence issue. We're looking at trying to promote outcomes in 3 different areas linked to what's already been presented. That development research is better able to demonstrate positive change for poor people, that development policies are better informed by new and existing evidence, and that partner countries are better able to conduct and use research. And it is the last 2 of those that I'd like to pose. We've been asked to present 2 questions, and I'd like to pose them around the latter 2 of those. The first one is around the policy environment. Policy is essentially a political process. Decisions are made often not on the basis of evidence, or certainly not on the basis of evidence alone. And I think we need to be much more pragmatic and realistic about that environment and how best can researchers position themselves in relation to that. And given that it is a different environment, the different skills, which was also brought up in the presentation this morning around networking, negotiating, knowledge brokering, etc. So my question is, how can development researchers position themselves more effectively in the policy political arena? And the second area has already been raised by colleagues as well, and it's around the need for partner countries to be better able to conduct and use research. And that's a whole issue of utility and relevance, etc. So my second question then is, how can Irish or external researchers work more effectively through all stages of the research approach and framework to support strengthening of local and national development processes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Richard.
So I'll just quickly go through the intro of the organisation. GOAL is an international development organisation working in 10 countries. We have a turnover of approximately 50 million per annum, strictly non-denominational. But in terms of humanitarian and development work, it's approximately 50-50 in terms of annual expenditure. We have 120 international staff and then 2,300 national staff. In 2010, we conducted approximately 35 external evaluations across our countries and 55 internal. We do quite a lot of internal surveying. We have 3 sectors for 2012-2016 because we're just developing our new strategic plan at the moment, and they are health with a particular focus on health system strengthening. So that was really interesting to hear your emphasis on that. Livelihoods and child protection is our third. I think an important point here, and this isn't just going to get into the whole area of complementing each other, okay, is Irish Aid has in particular, and this isn't said enough, been very supportive of innovations and research that we would conduct. And that's something that's been really appreciated. We probably haven't said it enough. Just in terms of, I actually went back to Mac's original points on making better use of research, and I'm focusing a lot here on how it's actually used, because my sense earlier on today and listening today is we were focusing a lot on the commissioning of the research. And to some extent, my own experience is that we tend to use, where we've used something before, we tend to commission again. So it comes back to whether you use the last piece of research or not. to some extent. So there's a few points here, and I think the first point is on usefulness. I think there is a tension there between what NGOs see as useful and applicable in that particular context, which might not be very highbrow in that sense for their program, and desire, on the other hand, for the student perhaps to contribute something new and innovative to the academic world. And that's a question I would have for students. And the question is your sense in preparing your thesis and going through your course, is your sense that there's a priority placed on your findings actually being applied? Because I was very encouraged to hear earlier on Claire talk about the fact that she went back and she actually fed back the findings through the women's groups. She actually fed it back. And that's not to be assumed. I mean, clear dissemination and quality of dissemination and being more creative about how the findings are actually got out there, other than pressing send after you've submitted your thesis. I mean, I think that's a critical area. I think the second point is just on design and local input at the start, and this is definitely in the NGOs' interest to grab the bull by the horns and really grapple with the design and the questions at the very start and say, these are the questions we want. We know you find those questions really interesting, but they may not be useful to us. So in that sense, maybe we need to be a little bit ruder and say, look, that's all very well and fascinating, but this is what we need to answer. And we perhaps need to grapple with that a lot more. Planning, I think the research needs to be linked a lot more with, after the research is concluded, and this is related to dissemination, the agreement or rejection of the findings. And having that stage where actually the NGOs may come to the conclusion and say, actually, we don't agree with you, rather than just let it drift on. And again, no one wants to be rude. And that can be related to perhaps building action plans, designating who is going to take it forward and when, and setting deadlines. And that can be before the thesis is actually finally approved. That can be when it's actually finished, as opposed to 3 or 4 months later and waiting until Christmas, perhaps. Timing of research. I think a great opportunity in terms of timing is, we were talking about this a little bit during the break, is that for us, there's particular timing and windows in which we're particularly open to being influenced by research, and that can be around strategic planning or particularly large proposals. And then suddenly, if you do your research during that window, it's much more likely that your findings will be applied. So there has to be a sense of urgency and urgency driver. So if you're doing your research, it can be really good to try and find some urgency driver for how it's going to be actually applied. And dissemination, again, a point I can't come back to dissemination enough. Just make sure be creative. CD-ROMs, radios. Okay, quickly on to questions. The first one was around what incentives in your course would be applied in order for you to be driven to actually make the most practical recommendations you can. Is your supervisor pushing or hinting towards you should have something that's academically innovative or more applicable to the NGO and what they want in that context? Maybe it can be both, hopefully. Second question then is it's quite perhaps a technical issue, and it's just around impact assessments. And it's an area we really grapple with, and the word impact means a lot of things to different people. Long-term sustained change is not something that's easy to measure. And we are experimenting with controlled trials and different methodologies, and it's not easy to come up with valid comparisons. And I would be interested to hear if people have come up with any ethical issues around people being control groups and applying those quasi-experimental designs. It's a big issue at the moment for us anyway. And then I suppose the final point I would make is that for us, I think the question is not so much around doing the research, it's about using the data and knowledge management. A lot of our discussions at the moment is not just about generating new information, it's actually using what we have and what's out there, and using a lot more secondary data.
Thank you very much. Okay, Cleona.
Hi, my name is Cleona Sharkey. I'm the Environmental Justice Policy Officer with Trúgra. I work in the livelihoods team, and I suppose the reason I was sent to take part in the discussion is because I'm part of the team in Trúgra working on a 2-year study on climate change in 4 countries, 2 in Latin America, 2 in Southern Africa. The research is looking at 3 research questions: how climate change is being experienced at the household level, what people are doing to adapt, and trying to identify some of the internal and external factors that are impacting on people's ability to take up adaptation strategies and the effectiveness of those strategies. So it's a 2-year longitudinal study. I have a short intern briefing on the research, which is also at the back. If anybody's interested in talking about that research in more detail afterwards, please come and talk to me. At first, just to say thanks very much to the speakers in the first session. It was really interesting, and I appreciated the diversity, if you like, of the content of the presentations. I think, as a couple of the other speakers have touched on, some of the issues that we would maybe bring up from the NGO or from another side came across in those presentations, particularly around going back and sitting down with the NGO and discussing your research findings. And I suppose before coming to this, my primary experience in TRUCRA around structured research has been this project. But I spoke to a few people before coming here, and I can say to Karen that your findings from your probably much more structured research resonated, I think, with a lot of the things that I was hearing back. I suppose in terms of the questions I would put out for discussion, as I said, they relate very much to some of the points that have been made by the others. I suppose if you think for the academics to think about why do NGOs get involved in research with universities, with researchers? What's in it for the NGO? What are the circumstances in which the two come together? Who approaches who? What are the objectives? What's in it for us? Do we get involved because it's good to be seen to be working with these academic institutions? Is it to maintain relationships? Is it because actually the research is of real interest and it's timely and actually can concretely feed into the work that we're doing? Is there a current wish within the NGO to actually improve knowledge and practice within their organisation? So these are things that can have an impact both on the collaboration process and also, very importantly, on the impact of the research. Is it actually going to make any difference afterwards? Are there going to be any changes as a result of the research? So just to think about what's in it for NGOs, why do we get involved with researchers and academic institutions? The other thing I would ask, and this relates very much to Bruno's point, was that myself, I have more of a policy and advocacy background, so I very much see development as a political process with technical elements to it. And so academic research is very useful for those of us who are so involved in political processes, in the here and the now of change, that it's difficult to actually see change objectively, to actually stand back and see how does change actually happen. Are we working with the right people? Are we doing the right things in order to be able to achieve the change we seek? So the academic research, that more objective stance is extremely useful. But how do we bridge the timing issue, and how do we bridge the general and the complex to bring it to something that's more specific, that's more actionable for the people who are involved in political processes in the here and the now? So that's a challenge to both of us, I guess, and sure, something I'd be interested in discussing. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Conal.
This is on? Yeah, okay. I'm Conal Foley. I'm the Director of Strategy, Advocacy and Learning, which is basically the policy unit in Concern Worldwide. For those of you who don't know Concern is about 40 years old, quite an old one, quite a big one. We basically work in health, education, HIV and livelihoods across about 25 countries. We've been reducing our number of countries. We do an awful lot of research, and I think I would mirror what Irish Aid said about 5-6 years ago, where we suddenly realised we're doing a huge amount of research, all sorts of different types, yeah, but we don't have a strategy. It's very scattergun. And it's one of the things we need to do is to actually have a much more developed strategy around research. I mean, I have a load of comments. Mac, you changed the goalposts on me. We had loads of things, yeah, 2 big questions when I had a load of things prepared, but there you go. I suppose one of the biggest questions for us really goes back to our mission statement. I think this is probably true of most NGOs. And the question is this: where does the creation of knowledge and field-based evidence sit in the action-focused mission statement of an NGO. And I suppose it is this issue about what are you trying to change actually? You know, is it policy? If you are, then knowledge becomes incredibly important and research becomes quite central to your way of working. But most NGOs are still very, you know, focused on practical, tangible results for the poorest. And it's trying to get that balance is critical. I think for us, we feel our balance is far too much on the tangible results for very poor people against systemic change. I think this is where the real issue is around where do you see your role in terms of systemic change vis-a-vis very practical outputs, if you like. So that's, I think, a critical one because it really brings you back up to the whole mission of the organization. And that's obviously very linked to the idea of the roles of NGOs. I don't know how many of you are aware of the famous David Corton's work on the roles of NGOs, where he looks at going further and further upstream, looking at the root causes of poverty and away from very tangible inputs. It is also, I think, where you are related in terms of that role. I'll move on to the second one, Matt, don't worry. We have an awful lot of other research questions. It'll be very practical ones like what impact has land tenure on women's empowerment, things like how can we most effectively build systemic resilience to regular shocks like drought or conflict at community level. But maybe another key one for an organisation like ourselves is, and I think particularly when we think about engagement with researchers, is how can research be better driven by country development needs? So if you think about all of our programs, they're now trying to be aligned with, you know, PRSPs, country strategies, etc., and it is around how do we answer the key questions that are at country level between us, and how do we come up with more joint analysis of the problems and then joint analysis of research needs and then jointly work towards addressing those. I think they're kind of high-level questions. Yep.
Hi, my name is Anita Friel. I work with Oxfam Ireland. For those of you who don't know, Oxfam or Oxfam Ireland is an independent organization, a member of the Oxfam Confederation. There are about 14 Oxfam affiliates, members of the organization. We are an international development organization, and so we work with, I suppose, like many organizations, other international NGOs here. We would do work around what we call rights in crisis, around essential services, economic justice, and gender justice. We also say that we're a movement for social change. So that sort of reflects a lot of the work that we do around advocacy and campaigning. And speaking on around these two facets, if you like, that we have as an organization around direct programming or so-called service provision, and then advocacy and campaigning and mobilizing. This is where the first question that we have within our own organization, that what should be the balance between the two? Is it that by you providing a service, what you're actually doing is you're prolonging the problem and giving states and governments an excuse to not provide the services for their citizens, and at the same, so should the role then be more into empowering citizens who demand for these services from their states and their governments, and also, while also enabling states, to provide these services. So that's, I suppose, the first question. And it's, as I said, it's a question that we have within our own organization. Mightn't be a research question, could be turned into a research question, I'm sure. The second question, and I suppose around research, and yeah, like Connell, we were asked to prepare, and we prepared our slides and everything. But sticking with the advocacy, actually, I did some research for Oxfam, how important is research about advocacy. It turned out that actually it is the #1 effective strategy in advocacy and the #1 essential capacity for advocacy. So if you want to influence policy, if you want to change policy, that's what actually works. That's what works with policymakers. That's what works with, even with communities, with poor people. People want to know how credible you are and where is your evidence, is coming from. Why are you saying, why are you asking for this change? So I suppose that's why we know that research, certainly in the field of advocacy, is very important. Now, in the other end of what we do, in the service provision or in the practice, I was thinking about this. Actually, I think we're a bit we're a bit more constrained, if you like, in using and implementing research into practice by the fact that quite a lot of our work is done with supporting national, and local organizations, and they're bound to quite often implement national policy and national guidelines. Now, the assumption is that, this is based on research, but is it, up-to-date research? Not often, and obviously there are reasons why sometimes that is not the case. There are reasons why governments cannot change their policies, even financial reasons. Sometimes that can't be afforded. Certainly in the field of, HIV and AIDS, we would love to, for every country, to adopt the new WHO guidelines. But I mean, they're costly. They mean you need to put more people, in treatment and so on. So we understand, I suppose, our constraints in the field of research. But to go back then to research influencing then policy and practice, and as I say, I suppose the reason why I brought the example of practice is that, in my view, for the way that we work, then what you need to influence first is the policy, and then from that falls, the influence and change of practice. So the second question then is in relation to the role of the academia then in using research to influence policy and practice. For as long as I've been in academia, and that hasn't been very long, the feeling that I've had, and that this might sound very controversial, is that the academics, there is this perception, if you like, that, well, their role is just to do the research and publish, and this is it, and then it's for the others then to take it, do something about it. I don't think that's, now, certainly that probably isn't either in the mission statements of the universities, but that seemed to me to be the case, and that seemed to me, that's also, when I've been talking to my colleagues, that seemed to be the perception, certainly from some of the NGO colleagues. So I don't actually think that should be the case. I mean, I think it's unethical to not act on knowledge. Certainly that's what, we do. We try to influence policy change. So that's why then, where is the role of the academia in all this, and what can they do? And then maybe they can't do it alone, but well, how can we do this together?
And Sorley, please.
Good morning, and apologies for being late. I won't go into the details of why I'm late, but my apologies. As a result, I don't have two big questions, but I do reserve the right to come back to two big questions later on if they do occur to me. I should say something about Christian Aid, and Christian Aid is a development organization working in about 50 countries around the world. What characterizes us is, I guess, one, that we are owned by the churches in Britain and Ireland. We're not a proselytizing, evangelizing organization. We work almost exclusively through partners, and we, as part of our approach, we tackle the structural causes of poverty, in addition to working in emergency humanitarian situations, but primarily we view our development work as tackling the underlying structures that are making people poor and keeping people poor. I have some things to say about research. I don't know whether we're at that stage now. I mean, I've missed some of the earlier submissions, and so perhaps this is repeating it, but I think it's clear that often academia and research are missing each other like ships in the night. Researchers often having a tendency to getting bogged down in theory, to the detriment of getting across the significance of their findings. Similarly, NGOs can be too keen to sell the idea without the research behind it. And I think we're probably at the stage now where that is self-perpetuating, and as long as researchers don't see the potential for their influence in NGOs, they will tailor their output to their own audience, which makes it much less attractive for NGOs to get involved in. There are other more practical limitations and challenges to research, but I think probably we'll come to that later, will we? Or if you want to make a couple of points. Okay. I think, well, I was trying to think of a couple of things that might not have been said by other members of the panel. I don't know if I'll have succeeded, but yeah, I know. But was the issue of access to research raised? I mean, that often that the research that has been generated by academia is paid for and funded by public sources, But yet, in order to access that, often you have to pay for that material. And that makes it much more difficult for NGOs to access, unless you have one of the Athens passwords, which enables you to access it. The second thing is, I think researchers are increasingly in Ireland gearing their research for publication in high-profile, esoteric publications for the purpose of raising the profile of the university. And that's what's become much more competitive, and that's the driving force behind a lot of the research, or part of the driving force behind the research, to the detriment of publishing it in a much wider range of publications accessible and useful to NGOs. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Good points to end with there. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, so thank you to each of our panelists there. As Conal indicated, I sort of changed the goalposts on them a bit. I don't feel that bad because they're all involved in international development and they know whenever you go to do something, it's never as possible can be. But the justification for having changed the goalposts on them was to give you more time to ask questions and to sort of interact with them. So in terms of the general themes that we've been talking about, sort of evidence, I guess certainly one thing that was added on quite strongly there, I think for several people, was the notion of utilization. You can have the evidence, but what's it for? What do you do with it? How do you implement it? And so on. And then I think also this idea of how do people get to the evidence that is there, and also the notion of governance that I mentioned earlier. So these are just some of the themes. I'd like you to ask some questions, either specifically to people or more general questions, and people can have a turn to respond to them. So, David. So again, if you can identify yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, I'm David Taylor. I'm the Chair of Geography here at Trinity College, and I'm also the Chair of Tidy at Trinity College. Really enjoyed this morning's sessions, and I'd like to thank everybody for contributing. I just really want to make a point rather than add to this list of questions. And that's, I think, we really, and to some extent this is feeding on from the last speaker, to some extent I think we're in danger of being over-complacent here. And what springs to my mind is how in development we can ensure that we attract the best researchers into the future, because it's the best researchers who we need to attract to ensure the work that we do has the greatest impact and also leads to better outcomes, I am sure. And I think we really need to think along the lines, how are we going to compete with these other areas in terms of attracting the best researchers?
Okay,
There's an issue that I just want to get out there, just to be clear, right? Be very careful about the stocks and flows of knowledge, okay? So a university's mission is, a large part is education. Think of training doctors, nurses, economists, accountants. Do you not think in their undergraduate courses they get taught the flow of knowledge that has been published and distilled and brought into undergraduate texts, and it's imparted through the young people who go out into the world, who work in all sorts of professional things, right? So this idea that on the margin an individual's research is not that accessible and that you have to immediately has to be, there is a way of creating and dispersing knowledge inside academia that has worked for 500 years, and you shouldn't forget that that is a big part of what we do, is professional training through our students both at undergraduate and master's level, right? Like all the research, all the medical, when you go to your general practitioner, there is probably 5,000 or 6,000 great research papers that have basically influenced how he gives you drugs, how he diagnoses you, how he treats you, etc. Right? So to say that academia is not creating knowledge and dispersing it when it's happening every minute and every day of your life, I think we have to be worried, right? It's about stocks and flows, right? So the stock of knowledge, how it's dispersed.
Okay, thank you. Other question?
My question is, my name is Bonix, I'm based in the Center for Global Health, Trinity. My question is, why do you think humanitarian aid workers need master's degrees if they don't promote evidence-based practice in the humanitarian area. So for me, I would expect that people who hold those masters to promote evidence-based practices. And if they're not, I think they are more driven by ideology rather than things happening in those countries affected. I'm going to quote Bill Clinton, who said that the problem with ideologies is that you have got all the answers in advance. So evidence is irrelevant. So I think you have to understand that there are NGOs who promote what we call the right-based approach, which means that people are suffering, they need help. We don't have to question. So they are not into indicators to assess what they are doing. They are not interested in impact. And they would promote books like Sphere Standards in humanitarian, which most of the indicators don't have any scientific basis to prove what they are doing. So what I think the word, the term one size fits all drives most of humanitarian workers. There is a problem with ideology. If research can't be included in NGOs' practices, then therefore in the ideology. And I don't think that we should waste our time asking researchers to produce research if they can't be used. And also we do understand that making decisions in such complex situations, not only research funding is important, but there are other contexts. But if you have to make critical decisions, and if you have to spend billion or hundreds of million to development, at least you should use something that will help you to assess if what I'm planning to do can work because it has been proven or not. But if you avoid to use research fundings that prove that what you are doing is wrong or it doesn't show what you are planning to do, then I think the problem with ideology, because it's clear that the research shows that also international aid doesn't reduce poverty, and it's clear. And if people don't change their mind since then, because they are driven by ideology, then I think we're wasting our time. Thank you.
I think we get two more questions and then we'll put it back to the panel.
Thanks very much. Pádraig Carmody again in Geography. Just a couple of points, maybe, Mac. Just to say a word in defence of Irish Aid, that you identified the fact that the development research was weak here 10 years ago and that we needed to build up our capacity to engage in development research and with the developing world. And I think they have had a stepwise approach to that, focusing here and then moving towards a kind of southern-led approach. So hopefully that'll be fruitful. The second issue that occurs to me is around this issue of evidence-based research. Research is a political process. What evidence? Who gets to decide what to investigate? How is that formulated? What are the power relations that go into that? How does some evidence get picked up and other evidence not get picked up? So that's an issue that we have to be wary of. The third point is that we should be aware that we have different missions. Irish Aid, NGOs, academia, we all have different missions. There's a tendency in international development to focus on coherence, alignment, and bringing everybody's agenda together, in a sense. But I think there's a case for unalignment. We want to have a diversity of voices and perspectives. There's a creative synergy and tension which arises from these kinds of discussions. So I think we should be careful about the kinds of engagements we have. We need to be strategic about them. We need to be cognizant of the fact that we can't do everything. Academics have to teach, publish, do service, and then community outreach or societal engagement is a fourth category. So there's a division of labour in the sector, and we need to acknowledge that as well.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's a question or more of a response to one of your questions about to students, what is the sense of priority placed on your findings, and then also what you said, Sorley, about that researchers are bogged down in theory. And I'll just talk about my own experience as a researcher. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Claire Hawkins. I'm in the Masters in Development Practice here. And so from what I understand and what I've been taught in my course about the role of a researcher is to work, to kind of give an outside perspective to an organization. It doesn't matter who you're working for, but you work independently and you work with a non-bias and without influence. And also that you also work as a kind of an intermediate, from my own experience, you're working as an intermediate between the beneficiaries of what the research you're trying to find out about and the organization that you're working for. And kind of that you place priority on finding research that is statistically relevant, is robust, and has enough value that you can bring it back to the organization and show them kind of a real value in the work that you carried out, and that kind of that research is significant, you know. So it's a huge kind of responsibility of the researcher that you show that it's significant, and as well as that that you add value. And this is kind of one of the most important points that I kind of learned when in my first year of my course, is that you go back and you add value, and that you make sure that link was made. But also, not to go on, but kind of another issue that I had was holding back results. And when I was working with Care International, there was some issues that I found, and I was almost kind of afraid to bring it to them and to explain that, because I thought there might be some controversy around it. So I talked to a researcher that previously worked with Care, and they said the best thing that you can do is to present your results to them, present it well, and show that where the results are significant, and that all you can really do then is just trust it in their hands. And so I suppose, and that's all you can do, and you have to step back at that point because you can't make any interventions, and that's their role. So that's just my point.
Okay, some people might disagree with that, but we'll see. So who wants to make some comments in response to some of these questions? Sorry, do you want to?
Just 2 points very briefly, and one was in relation to the chair of the geography department, is that right? Yeah, David. I mean, I think how to get the best research is a good question, but also one that we are asking as NGOs. How do we set up our organizations to attract quality technical experts into our organization? Because 10 years ago, I think you could say, I mean, for example, I don't think there was any economists working, there probably was one or two, within NGOs, because economists, what was their role within an NGO? The campaigns or the policies were campaign driven, and there wasn't that desire or that recognition of the role or the need for technical expertise. That now has changed, and I think if you look at Christian Aid, and I'm only speaking from Christian Aid's perspective, the two campaigns that we run on climate justice and on tax, we couldn't do it without the degree of technical expertise that's in the organization. So it's headed by two people with PhDs in relevant areas. And that's a conscious decision on the part of the organization to create the environment in which people who would otherwise be staying within academia can exercise their social justice conscience within an NGO setting. And that has not always been the case. And if you have, just very, very briefly, if you add to that, I mean, that has to be institutionalized within the organization and in very practical ways. How are the people that you're recruiting being recruited? Is it included in their job description a specific technical ability or capacity within an area that otherwise might be the domain of academia? And similarly, what about in your people's annual reviews? Is there a value attached to people's contribution to academic discourse, to the contribution and the publication on peer-reviewed journals? Is there a value attached to that? Is the time given over to it?
Sorry, could you respond to that peer-review issue?
Okay, very briefly.
peer review process is absolutely essential to academia. It's the quality assurance process. So of course, we could ignore the peer review process, we could ignore the submission to academic journals and publication in academic journals, and just simply get our information from Wikipedia.
I don't want to be, I think you might have misunderstood me. I mean, it's important that time is given within NGOs for employees to contribute to peer-reviewed journals. That's the point I'm making. So I'm not talking about Wikipedia or anything else.
So, anyone else want to? Oh, I saw you.
No, it's on. Just a couple of things. I mean, I think Bonix's point about ideology is spot on. I mean, it's interesting when we do strategic planning. The fact is that it's actually very difficult to make decisions without evidence internally, and it's a real constraint for us. And so then you do find that people start fighting or arguing along ideological lines, which is really problematic. So, you know, internally we do have those challenges, and I think that's important to recognise. I think there's a key thing that maybe just hasn't come out, and it's a small thing but actually significant. You know, NGOs are not monoliths. We often, most big NGOs particularly, have a major divide between the policy units and the practitioners, the managers. And, you know, it's often we don't have the right people in this room, actually. I'm not the right person to be in this room. It actually should be our managers who should be in the room, because they're the ones who are making judgments, who are taking decisions, and who struggle to use evidence. And for them, actually, a lot of them, research is almost a dirty word. And, you know, it's more, I think we need to demystify the idea of research. They actually use it, but they sometimes don't know how to manage it appropriately. So there's lots of barriers and interesting issues there, I think, that we need to explore. I thought it was interesting hearing from the World Bank Impact Assessment Unit in Trinity about 2 years ago when they were talking. Another interesting point is about the utilization of evidence and learning. What they were saying, I thought was really interesting, was most agencies prioritize their own learning over the learning of other external learning. I find that true in concern, again, from the management arm. They listen if it's been derived from our own experience. They listen less if it's been derived from the experience of others. That's a problematic bias which we need to address, but I think it's a fact, or I've seen it. So I think it's that how change happens is a significant point. Just going back to Pádraig Carmody's, the thing about separate missions and division of labour, I think what's important, is that, you know, I think ultimately multidisciplinary or multiple different perspectives will drive innovation and drive quality improvement. I think that's what we need. Whether it's a division of labour, how we go about it, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's important.
Thanks. It's working? Yeah, sorry. Just to, I would agree with what Conal said in terms of the policy and programme. I suppose what Trócaire has been trying to do since about 2006 is to have a much more integrated programme approach, which encompasses policy and programme implementation within programmes. So I straddle both support to our country programmes as well as leading on policy and advocacy around climate change issues here in Ireland, which is a challenge, but it's also provides that kind of holistic overview of the change that we're working on. I think I would agree with the points on research agendas being political, absolutely, and I suppose, and also relating to that, to the point made about it's okay to have different missions and different agendas, and I would agree with that. Like there are different roles for different actors in society, and that's valid. And I suppose the challenge for us is to see where do the research agendas and our missions overlap. And I suppose a call to those with social justice consciences to think about what's driving their research agendas. Is it money? Is it particular people? Is it, why are you interested in the research and what kind of change are you trying to achieve with it? And then I suppose where there is an overlap in agendas, how can we as researchers and NGOs work together to try and influence the change we want to achieve, trying to translate the research that you're doing into actual policy, concrete policy recommendations that we can advance either jointly or in our separate ways in the public domain. Thanks.
I enjoyed your question about ideology, but a couple of things hit me and I think what I tried to make aware about this thing about dreaming together is that there's a couple of comments like academics should place themselves in the sort of the context of, you know, what governments want to do, maybe what Irish Aid wants to do, what the NGOs want to do. But in reality, you know, there's a two-way process there in the sense that maybe the academic is the one who has a social conscience too. I mean, it's not that they don't. They want to set an agenda and they want to be listened to. So compromise there, to be fair to both sides, is to, you know, ex ante do it together. Do you know what I mean? And not to have agendas already on the ground that you have to force yourself into. And I'll give you an example. So I had a phone call from Goldman Sachs, you know, asking me they need a professional report justifying bankers' pay, right? That you should allow pay not to be capped to 500,000, that it should go up to $1 million. And we're willing to pay you up to 600 grand, whatever you want, if you can really make an effective argument, right? But to me, when I see NGOs coming to me saying, you know, we're desperate for somebody to evaluate this intervention because we got 20 million, and we're desperate for somebody to give us some good evidence to justify to our funders that we're doing something, like, there's still the same moral hazard for me, right? In the sense that I don't want to get involved in things I don't believe in. You know what I mean? So I think it's very important that, and it could be, as David is kind of saying, that, and Irish Aid has pointed out to us, we are behind the curve. We have not been involved in international development enough. We're not at the frontier enough. We're not pushing our agendas, because if we were, the agencies would look at us and they go, wow, we need to fold into what they're doing, etc. So I know there's a timing issue, etc. But I just keep this point about dreaming together ex ante, right? It's very, very important, right? For any sort of partnership or any sort of effectiveness of or any sort of work.
Yeah, I think Irish Aid's getting off quite lightly, actually, today. It's between the academics, researchers and NGOs. And I think we are all agreed that we operate in different spheres. And of course that's positive, and we have to look at where those overlaps occur. But those overlaps and the relevance of that is changing all the time. And we are doing some work at the moment on the review of the government's white paper on international development. And I've been involved in some work around context analysis, the big questions out there and the implications of that. And people will be very aware of these things like the geopolitics, the lack of international governance frameworks, the falling away of the multilateral system, really big international challenges imposed again and related to issues like climate change, financial crisis, hunger crisis, etc. So I think we have to be very, very realistic around what it is we do and our own importance in that environment. And for us, I think there is a challenge around what is Ireland's role collectively, not Trinity or Irish Aid or Goal, but is there something distinctive about what Ireland has to offer in the combination of those actors? And it would be useful, I think, to think about both reviewing what that has been in the past and what it is likely to be in the future. And I would just encourage colleagues from across all of those spectres to look to the white paper as an opportunity to get your ideas and perspectives in around it, because it's back to that question of wanting to influence change, both out there, wherever out there happens to be, and in here in Ireland. And I think that is one opportunity, but we have to be realistic about how important that is, but it is important for us. So it would be useful, very useful to say that. Could I just pick up on one point that Bonix made in relation to the humanitarian response? Just in terms of our own research spend, to link it to that, Irish Aid spends in the region of 30 million euros per year on research. Less than a quarter of that is going directly into Irish institutions or organisations. Most of it is in relation to international and global institutions and partnerships, and at country level as well. Probably over 60% though to the international partnerships. And one area that is a huge gap is around humanitarian response. And one of the reasons for that is the distinctions that we as policymakers as NGOs make between what is humanitarian response and what is development challenge. We make those distinctions, but people that are experiencing hunger or vulnerability as the result of climate change or famine or whatever are not making those distinctions. So I think on the one level we have to be much more political and we have to be much more aware of those global challenges, and at the same time we really have to be much more aware of the evidence and the experience of people in this context of global development. Thanks.
We have literally 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take one question here and allow anyone from here who hasn't responded to respond, but no new responses. So.
Sorry, just to pick up on what you just said. My name's Stacey Dunn. I'm the MSc Environment class, and my research was in Liberia, and it was based on it was a concern internship, and it was based on gender-based violence. And I just wanted to kind of make the point from a student's perspective. Like, I was going there doing research for concern, but also for myself for my thesis. So you can say that I had an academic hat and also a researcher's hat. So just from my perspective, when I wrote my thesis, it was kind of theory-based and it had everything like that, but I'm still in the process of finishing off my paper for concern, but it was about the practicalities and what concern can actually do. And what I really found was that I hear the word policies and everything, and I know that is the main issue. You know, you have to go to government level and you have to do everything like that, and there is politics within these NGOs, but what I found was that it was just my research it's a major grassroots issue, and what I would kind of just like to ask or just to point out is it better to look at policies of government and just deal with that, or especially for gender-based violence, it's something completely, you know, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. Would you be better off going to a grassroots level and actually, as you said, Brona, just discussing it and implementing changes within a society that you're talking about, rather than going to a government level? As in Liberia, one policy is that if a teacher abuses a child, but if he feels remorse for his abuse, let's say rape, or if he gets married to the child, then he gets off scot-free. So I'm thinking that could, I gave these I presented these findings to concern already. I was told, obviously, it's very depressing and it's the reality of the situation, but I'm just saying, would it be better to look at a kind of grassroots level instead of just always talking about policies and government level?
Thank you. So any last comments from someone who hasn't commented? Okay. One quick question then.
Try to keep it as quick as possible. My name is Ronan McDermott. I'm a doctoral student at the Humanitarian Action Program in UCD. I was just wondering what would be different about the partnership between NGOs and researchers in humanitarian settings specifically. I'm thinking of the potential implications in terms of, you know, practical issues with security and logistics of getting researchers into humanitarian crisis settings, and also the ethical issues of conducting research in such settings. Thank you.
Okay, no more questions from here. Does anyone here want to make a... Yeah.
Not in response to the issues, because I don't think we have time, unfortunately, to address the questions. But I just wanted to add something to the comments was made earlier around this fact that you are dealing with two different organizations, type of organization, NGOs and universities. Because I did some research for the Center for Global Health, and my own organization, looking into the different needs that an institution like the Center for Global Health has in relation to research for the master's students in global health and NGOs, and that's why we did the research, because we recognized that there are different needs and different missions and different set of goals and values and cultures even, and some of the challenges. Speaking of the challenges, because that's what the session was supposed to be about. What we found out was that, at least from what came out from the NGOs, for example, one NGO, the whole, the sensitivities and the limitations of working sometimes with a faith-based organization, and the time, a faith-based organization would require for a student or for a researcher to spend, with them, so they understand, their culture, if you like. And another issue that was brought up was around ethical approval, because, I mean, as I understand, Trinity College would, if a researcher of that university would go in a certain country, they would require that, they get ethical approval not only from Trinity, but also, from that particular country. Now, of course, that's a very good thing to do, but the logistics of it, quite often what we found is that when NGOs do their research, they don't really go for ethical, approval now. That tells it all, but sure, that's what it is. So then, but the practicalities of getting that ethical approval from that particular country, and how that, what that means then for when you have your results. And obviously, as it was said here, NGOs want the results now, not a year later, because it's quite often to inform programs. Another issue was, around data ownership, which Karen, you brought up as well. One particular NGO that was interviewed, they were adamant that the data would only stay with them, as opposed to, be shared and published and so on. Which then, in a particular case of a student, that student had to do 2 pieces of research, one for their master's, and so that could be, owned by Trinity and published and so on, and the other one then for the NGO. I mean, is that practical? What strains does that put on the student and in the quality of work that is being produced, for both pieces of work? Also, expectations around the financing of research, who finances and what are, what these finances, should be for. Interestingly, the NGOs were actually willing to fund, if you like, the researcher, to fund the researchers, whereas there was no such expectation from the students, for example. They were willing to go, out there, even to pay their own way, as long as that this was, they would be well supported, they would gain access, but also that they produce something that NGOs, would use. So having said, I suppose what I said from the perspective of the NGOs, that okay, or the perception that, yeah, all this research is produced, but it's not really used. I think there is a desire, even from the researcher's point of view, that they want to produce research that is actually used as opposed to sitting in shelves. And finally, one interesting point is, while we're talking here about, I suppose, the links between, the Irish NGOs working overseas and the Irish universities, certainly one NGO that I interviewed, and that's actually staff from my own, is that the point was made that maybe who we should be linking up is Southern universities, really, as opposed to, the Irish universities. So that, where does it leave then, the Irish universities? So, quite a few challenges there. I just wanted to mention them.
Okay, thank you very much. The aim of this session was, I suppose, to problematize something that we are all very comfortable saying is a good thing, i.e. working together and to try and unpack some of the challenges. It's certainly my firm belief that if you can problematize those and be very upfront about the real problems that there are working together sometimes, then you can do it much more effectively. Not just effectively academically, but in terms of actually implementing the results as well. I think this is a topic, one thing that I'm going to contribute to, given that we do have a lot of partnerships, is trying to develop a model of best practice around this sort of thing. It's quite difficult, it's very hairy stuff, there's lots of sensitivities, but that's why it's really worthwhile doing it. So would you join me in thanking the panelists? This, as I said, is the sort of penultimate session of the tidy week for doctoral training students. And we have some certificates here, and Jenna is kindly going to read out people who are to be awarded these certificates for attending the programs, but also contributing today and in other days to the discussion. So this will only take a couple of minutes. And then we'll be encouraging you to go on to this afternoon's session, which starts at 1:30 with Derek Fee. There is a free lunch, is that right? And then you're going to get a very interesting insight from a European Commission perspective in terms of working particularly in Zambia, but I'm sure other aspects of that sort of experience as well. So.
Thank you very much, Matt. As part of the Development Research Week, we also have what we call the TIDY PhD multidisciplinary module, which is aimed at PhD students that intend to do research in developing countries or research into a development issue. And for the whole week, we've been sitting down in the Center for Global Health, thank you, having this series of lectures. And today we just want to publicly award the certificate and recognize the students that have been part of this module. So it wouldn't take much of your time, just 2 minutes. I'll call them quickly, and if they can quickly come in and take their certificates, that will be appreciated. And thank you, David, for signing those certificates. David is the chairman of the TIDY Steering Committee. So I'll call first Alexander Atkos. Aldo Zamit Boda, I'll just be calling. Sarah Kohembrada, if I pronounce it well, sorry. Mankuma Dada. Enida Frail. Gavin Glenn. Barbara Hatz. Anarina Kiov. Jill McAdle. Jill, not here. Ronan McDermott. Megan Morris. Alexis Nisbet. Matteo Viganotti. Sinead Walsh. Lucy Whitson. Lucy Whitson, Kwan Yang, Louise York, Julie Jumatai, Paul Quinn, Mohamed Sahan. Aldo Zamit. Chiomaku. Megan Morris. I'm missing all the certificates. Sorry, I'll get that across to you in no time. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay, so you may not have been expecting the sort of roll call at the end with the Anne Shaw and all the rest of it, but thank you all for participating. There's been a lot of work being put into this week. We would just have a small presentation to Nua Ibrahim for her work in facilitating things this week. But also would like to thank Noni and Sarah and Ogena and Sarah. Also, I'd like to thank David and all the other people who've contributed through the week. Please do stay around this afternoon for what promises to be a really interesting talk. And please continue talking about uncomfortable things like we did today. Thank you very much.